If you're over 70, this is a fairly easy sermon, because you were there. Okay? But for you younger ones, if you weren't alive in the 60s, the world changed in the 60s. And if you weren't there, you might look at things and think, well, it's always been this way. And it hasn't. So it might be a little harder for you to see the changes that have been made. My dad was about 10 years old. That would have been 1931. That was a while ago. But my dad was about 10 years old, he told me. And he lived, everybody lived on a farm in 1931. But I mean, they had a little farm. And they had a barrel out there. I don't know if it was a steel barrel or a wooden barrel. It could have been a wooden barrel in those days. But they kept grain for the cattle in it. And of course, that meant it was full part of the time and nearly empty part of the time. And he went out one morning, and the barrel was nearly empty. But as he looked over to reach down into it to get some grain, why, there were 3 or 4 big old Norway rats. Now, you people that grew up in the West, you missed it if you don't know what a Norway rat is. I mean, there's only one Norway rat. I mean, that is an ugly big rat. It's about that long, and then you add the tail. And you've got a creature about like that. As ugly a thing as you can imagine. Dad looked in there, a 10-year-old kid, you know, and he saw those 3 or 4 Norway rats, and he thought, I'm going to go get the tomcat. He's going to have a ball. So Dad, we went and he caught the tomcat, and he brought the tomcat back over, and he gave him a look at what he was going to let him have, tipped his head down into there, and then he threw the cat down into the barrel. He said, I don't know how long it took the cat to get from my arms to the bottom of the barrel, but I know it only took him half as long to get back out. If you have a biblical worldview, you believe that God created the heavens and the earth and everything that's in it. You believe there is one God, the only God. He is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. He has 3 personalities, but He is God. He is the God, the only God, and He is a personal God. He cares about you individually. And you believe that every human being who has ever walked the face of the earth will someday stand before that God. That we are accountable individually to God. You believe that Jesus Christ sacrificed Himself for our sin on a cross. That He was God, that He died, that He was buried, that He resurrected, and that He went back to heaven. And you believe that the only way to eternal joy, the only way to eternal joy is through Jesus Christ. Amen. You believe that there is a one world government coming at what we call the end of the age. Not something we're looking forward to. A time of great evil that will culminate in the Battle of Armageddon and the return of Jesus Christ. That was last week's sermon. If you missed it, you got the 3-minute version, but that's what it was. Write it down. Mankind is spiritual. All mankind is spiritual. You may not be Christian, but every society ever investigated by anthropologists, there is a spiritual dimension in every culture in the world. Mankind is spiritual. If you don't find the God we've just talked about, you will find another spiritual dimension. You will seek a spiritual dimension. April 12th, 1861 stands out in history as a famous day, an infamous day. An infamous day. April 12th, 1861. The cannon fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, and the Civil War had begun. The Civil War in America was really a war about ideas. I mean, that's what it was. The Civil War was a war of ideas. Who's right, who's wrong, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. It was a war of ideas. America is currently in a second civil war. We are in a second civil war, and it is a war of ideas. It's a war of ideas. It's a second civil war. There has been a lot of blood spilled, which we will look at next week. There's been a lot of blood spilled, but not many shots fired. The shots that have been fired in the Civil War have been in the form of speeches, music, movies, law. That's the way these shots have been fired in this new Civil War. To go back and look at where this thing all started, I want to focus on what we all know and heard. We've spent a lot of time talking about America's greatest generation. They were the generation of kids that my dad was a part of. Born 1928 through 1935. These were the guys who grew up as teenagers in the Great American Depression. They lived through the Depression. They were kids that knew what it was like to go to school in bare feet, not because it was so much fun to run with your toes in the mud, but because they had no shoes. They knew hardship from the bottom up. They knew how you could tough it out when there was nothing to do but be tough. They understood that. And because of that, when World War II came along, we were eventually able to name them the greatest generation, because this generation of Americans was willing to sacrifice everything, for peace and security in the world. They went off to war, and they won freedom, not just for America, but for the world. And we have rewarded them by calling them the greatest generation. Now, the greatest generation came home, and we got the baby boomers. Okay? All of a sudden, these guys came home from war. They had been away from the continent for years, many of them. And if there was one thing they wanted to do, it was have a family and a piece of life that was worth having after the emotional distress of the war that they had been through. And so they came home, and they got married, and they started having kids, and we called all those brats the baby boomers. That happens to be anybody that's a year younger than me, that starts, if you're 74, you're a baby boomer. If you're 75, you're not. So all you brats that came immediately after me, and for the next 12 or 13 years, are the baby boomers. That's who they were. But they also became the me generation. They became the me generation because Mom and Dad worked feverishly. Mom and Dad worked without pausing to build a better life for these kids. And in the results, these kids were spoiled. They had things a dozen times easier than their parents ever did. And while their parents talked a lot about God, this generation of kids didn't really buy into what they were hearing. They really believed that the God of their parents was materialism. It was all about building houses and buying farms and getting equipment. It was all about materialism. Well, they had had nothing in the Depression. They sacrificed everything in the war, and they were going after it. But the generation of young people that grew up during the early 60s, that generation they didn't really accept the ideas of their parents. They really did not accept the talk about God and all of that they were hearing. They were the first generation to be taught evolution in school. They were the first generation that at home they heard about God, but at school they heard that we all came from one-celled amoeba. At that time, if you were old enough to be in that group, it was one-celled amoeba that crawled out of the slime. Nobody ever answered where the slime came from. I mean, the slime had to come from someplace, but nobody ever dealt with that. They crawled out of the slime, and they turned into frogs, that turned into monkeys, that turned into people, who turned into your wife. I think I got that right, I think. But they were the first generation to be taught that. They were also the first generation then that was in high school when God was outlawed in school. 1963, God was outlawed in school. This doesn't work. You can't have prayer, Bible study, singing hymns. You can't have that in school. This is a bad thing. So as a result, these kids of that age group, seeing the dichotomy between what their parents claimed to believe and what they saw as reality in the world, we had, some of us remember the great term that grew up. It's the only time in American history that we've ever had this term that we used called generation gap. We had the generation gap. Always before in American history, kids were anxious to grow up and be adults and run in Dad's footsteps. But now suddenly we wanted nothing to do with what the old culture had established. We were going on our own new way. And so we had this gigantic thing that eventually they termed the generation gap. I think the first official shot in the Second Civil War was fired on April 8th, 1966. That was the date when 37 Methodist seminary preacher students made national headlines in all the newspapers, and it became the biggest, one of the biggest Time magazine covers of all time. I had Josh look it up, or somebody looked it up for me the other day. The cover that came out on April 8th remains one of the most circulated covers of all times. God is dead. On Time, they reversed it and said, "Is God dead?" In the newspapers, it was "God is dead." And it was the Methodist Bible students going to be preachers in seminary who declared that. And what they declared was, the God we have learned about as kids growing up is no longer needed in the culture we now live in. That age is gone. God is dead. So, remember, all men are spiritual. If you delete God, you're going to add something else. So the generation of the 60s traded God for paganism. Now, you may think paganism is the lack of all religion. Paganism is not the lack of all religion. If you look it up, there's even a set of rules that go with paganism. Paganism has tenets, concepts, and rules. And this week I've sat behind a stack of 8 books trying to go through all of these things line by line and paragraph by paragraph to try and get to a point that I could explain all of these things. But paganism is in itself its own faith. It is its own faith. You may think you have no faith, but you are following the faith of paganism. So it is not the absence of religion, but in fact it is its own religion. Satan is the supreme leader of paganism. In John 12, verse 31, Jesus was getting ready. He was in the temple. It was the week of the Passover. He was about to be offered on the cross. And while he was teaching, he said, the time has come for judging this world, when Satan, the ruler of this world, will be cast out. We find that in John chapter 12, verse 31. Jesus addresses Satan as the ruler of this world, and he is the father of paganism, which is the father of all false religions. Christians are monotheistic. Kids, we are monotheistic. We believe in one God. One God. But when we look at paganism, it is polytheistic. It is polytheistic. And that's one of the biggest things to get a hold of here in our culture. It is polytheistic. It believes in many gods. Many gods. Many gods. Paganism is polytheistic. Many gods. And because there are many gods, there are many moral standards. There are many moral standards. If you have many gods, you have many standards. So there is no single moral code. It boils down to whatever works for you is okay. Whatever you like is okay. Whatever you think is okay. Because in reality, in paganism, you can become your own God. You can become your own God. You can worship yourself. You can pick anything you want for a God. All nature is God. God is nature, and therefore everything is God. I am God. Shirley MacLaine, that's a name none of you young people know, but Shirley MacLaine was a television personality in the 80s, and she made super fame by shouting one night on national television, "I am God!" Then she made hundreds of dollars off each person who came to her seminars for the next 10 years to figure out how they could be God. We call them New Agers, we call them a lot of things, but it's really paganism. And since you have many moral codes, and whatever works for you is an acceptable moral code, then paganism really practices survival of the fittest. Christianity preaches we care for the weakest. Christianity says we care about the weakest. Paganism says it's survival of the fittest. It's survival of the fittest. So, everything is God. Human nature is God. Shirley MacLaine is God. Anybody who wants to be is God. In paganism, people worship themselves. The Bible says men love themselves and were given over to a reprobate mind. They fell in love with themselves and were given over to a reprobate mind. If I am God, then my instincts are godly. Okay? I'm going to read a paragraph directly out of one of the paganism manuals. If I am God, my instincts are godly. That means hunger, sex, aggression, pleasure. These are all holy. These are all holy. Okay? All right. Paganism, pagan religious ritual arouses instincts to the keenest possible pitch, especially sexuality and aggression. In gratifying these instincts, the greatest possible pleasure is achieved. Therefore, violent intoxication, temple prostitution, slaughter of one's enemies, self-mutilation. Take a look at how that's in America. Take a look at how there are many forms of self-mutilation that have surfaced in our culture. Self-mutilation and child sacrifice all become morally acceptable. These things all become morally acceptable. And child sacrifice, even child sacrifice, these things become morally acceptable. In paganism, I am God, and my desires are holy. So the seminary students expressed the view of their generation. They really did. The seminary students expressed the view of their generation. They said, we want to find our own gods. We want to find our own gods. So the first thing they found was the drug culture. Their drug culture was the first step in finding their gods. When drugs entered America, young people, it was really a spiritual dimension being offered. It wasn't just, wouldn't you like to be a drug addict so you could lay on the south side of the railroad tracks in Detroit? That was not what the drug culture was about. The drug culture was about, you can find peace in your own head. You can find peace in your head through drugs. Drugs were a spiritual event when they were brought out in the 60s. Okay? That was followed by the free love movement. We'll find peace through passion. We'll find peace through passion. In the free love movement, we said, you can love anybody, you can love anything. You can love any time, you can love any place. If you were alive during that time, you know that's exactly how that played out. And everybody was wearing the Just Do It t-shirts. Just do it. Just do it. Everybody knew what Just Do It meant, and just do it. Just do it. That was the free love movement. After the free love movement was developing fairly well, the social movement followed. We will find peace through political action. Okay? We'll find peace through political action. And we began seeing the demonstrations and the riots in college campuses and everything else. We will have peace through political action. Okay, this may come as a surprise to you. In 1964, Hillary Rodham, who became Hillary Rodham Clinton, was what was called a Goldwater girl. She was a Goldwater girl. Barry Goldwater, the most conservative guy to run for president in 50 years. I mean, he was so conservatives weren't sure they wanted to vote for Barry Goldwater. But Hillary was a Goldwater girl. Then a high school teacher handed her a Methodist youth magazine. Here we are back to the Methodist, a Methodist youth magazine that introduced her to leftist socialist ideas written by a man by the name of Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky is a name that you really need to know from the standpoint that he was a really hardcore socialist. He wrote the Manual for All Rebels. He called it Rules for Rebels. In his book, Rules for Rebels, if you look at the dedication page, it is dedicated to the first of all great rebels, Satan. It's dedicated to Satan. And Saul Alinsky says, if there really is a heaven or a hell, I sure hope I get hell. Well, bless your heart. I sure hope I get hell. Saul Alinsky had a very strong message that he preached. He preached that the way to change the world was not to be out there in the street throwing hand grenades at college buildings or setting them on fire or doing all the demonstrations that all of the kids were doing. Saul Alinsky said, the way that you change America, the way that you bring her down, which was the goal, bring her down. The way to bring her down is to pretend you are one of those people who you really hate. Get on the inside, use their own mechanisms to destroy them. Work from the inside out, not from the outside in. Don't bother throwing hand grenades or boycotting class. Get yourself into the inside. Act like you are one of them while you work against them. So Hillary became enamored. She was never in love with Alinsky, but she was in love with his ideas. She was enamored by his ideas. She invited him to be the speaker at her college, Wellesley College, and then when she graduated, she did her thesis paper on Saul Alinsky. Now, if you look that up, you won't find it at Wellesley College. You won't find it because when, in fact, her husband became president, they called Wellesley College and said, we want that paper locked up. So it's no longer available. Her paper on Saul Alinsky is not available. Alinsky was an absolute dedicated pagan. He saw Christian America as the roadblock to world peace. America's the only big obstacle to world peace and world government. If we can deal with America, the rest will happen easily. That was his idea. I have no idea where he calculated China to fit into that. That's always occurred to me as he might not have had China as well in his hand as he thought he did. Nonetheless, his big goal was to destroy America. Destroy American solidarity. Get America to where we don't believe one set of things. Get us fighting among ourselves. Destroy American solidarity. Pursue one world government. Meanwhile, the growing pagan culture was beginning to chip away at American values. We were chipping away at American values. All of a sudden, people who weren't pagans, but just girls and guys just started living together. That didn't, you young people might think that always happened. That didn't always happen. That didn't always happen. Every girl wasn't pregnant that got married. That wasn't the way it used to be. Or exposed, you know, I mean, it wasn't the way it was. But little by little, the pagan culture began to change all of the way Americans were living. Drugs, abortion, homosexual, and the gender confusion. These things began to move our culture completely in different directions. There was a steady push from the Alinsky forces to get liberalism and paganism into Congress. Get into positions of leadership and authority. George Bush Sr. If you had your television on that night, you remember it to this day. George Bush Sr. one night said, there is a new world order coming. If any of you heard that, liberalism, the liberals cheered, and every Christian who heard that trembled. There's a new world order coming, because you all knew what it meant. You all knew what it meant. The book of Revelation says there's a new world order coming, and when it comes, it's not a pleasant thing. But he talked about it, he said it, and everybody wondered, does he really know what he's saying? Is that something he's saying intentionally? Does he mean that? Does he know what he's saying? He never explained that. He just said there is a new world order coming. Then we began to hear the cry of countries without borders. We don't need borders. We need to begin to blend together. We are one world. We are one world. They began pushing us in that direction, little by little. So by the time we got into the 80s, from the 80s forward, we began flooding our country with the illegal immigrants. That started in the early 80s and got up to a point where by 2013, and actually from about 2005 forward, they figured there was 1.3 million illegal immigrants coming in every year, just pouring into the country. Because really, what we're looking for is to erase our borders, dissolve our borders, and become a one-world kind of thing. So, from the 80s forward, that movement was growing. So, as we began to look at the way Washington is changing, the rats of liberalism were jumping into the pork barrel of Washington as rapidly as they could. And they have two things. They hate Christians and they hate the Constitution. They really don't like our Constitution. Remember, one of our recent presidents was constantly saying, our Constitution ought to be a living document. What's that mean? That means we ought to be changing it. We ought to be modernizing it. It ought to be coming up to the culture we live in today. They really hate the old Constitution. They don't want anybody that fights for the old Constitution. Then George Bush Jr. came along. And George Bush Jr. may have cared, but I can tell you he wasn't much of a tomcat. When he looked at the situation, it was easier just to jump back out of the barrel than it was to deal with what he had in front of him. In 2008, Hillary was outflanked by an even greater disciple of Alinsky, Barack Obama. You can not like that, you can anything you want, but it's an absolute fact. He was devoted to Saul Alinsky's ideas. He was devoted to them, and he was the prime example of get in, talk like them, act like you're one of them, while all the time working against them. That was his goal. That was what he was doing. So for 8 years, through executive order and Supreme Court complicity, we just continued to destroy the values that America was built on as paganism continued to expand in our country. By 2014, President Obama simply turned to the Department of Homeland Security and he said, back off the border. Back off the border. And we began just getting untold floods coming through that couldn't be stopped. 2016, it was a foregone conclusion. Hillary would win. There were people in the FBI and the CIA who were making sure no other candidate could win. Couldn't happen. Wasn't going to happen. Nobody else could win. This would be the coup of paganism. Christian America would be silenced. It's not very hard to remember back 2 or 3 years ago when you didn't even dare say you weren't going to bake a cake for somebody because you could end up in trouble for it. Okay? So the election of 2016 was going to be the coup of paganism. America would be silenced. Borders would be thrown open. Socialism would be within the reach of the pagan cultures that were growing up. And a pathway to world government would be established. And then, America elected a lion. That's what happened. We elected a lion and threw him into the barrel of rats. And they began scurrying. They began scurrying in every direction. What we're seeing on the news now, I can't even say her name, OAC or whatever her name is. Yeah, I was going to write it down, but I didn't write it down. But Alexandra, Octavio, whatever it is. You couldn't have, nobody would have said what she says 15 years ago in the halls of Congress. But now that suddenly there is a pushback, those who have bold liberal ideas, they're jumping up and screaming now. We need to destroy every building in America. We need green peace. They're screaming their ideas, desperately hoping that there's enough believers out there to overwhelm this new movement that's coming up and saying, we're taking America back. I don't like his tweets. I don't think I care for his demeanor. But I agree with Franklin Graham, who says he has done more for Christian America than any president in my lifetime. Amen. He has done more to push back paganism than anybody we've ever had. So the rats in Washington have begun scrambling. Young people, one world government is coming. It is. Trent, one world government is coming. When I was your age, Trent, I knew one world government was coming. And I believed it might come in my lifetime. I didn't want it to come in my lifetime. I hoped that I could get done and get off the boat and leave it for you. let you deal with one world government. You got to pack 2 or 3 guns. You got to pack all kinds of stuff. But I was hoping, but one world government is coming. It's coming. But I can tell you what we can all know. President Trump has pushed it back. If he is able to continue pushing it back, it may hold it up. When President Reagan got elected, Ken was old enough by that time to be paying attention to what was happening in the world. When he got elected, we were marching steadily toward liberalism, and I remember saying at the family table, this is not really a change in national direction, this is a recess from liberalism. This is a recess from liberalism. And that's what we have now. That's what we have now. And if Christian America doesn't grab a hold of it and rush forward and claim some of this territory, problem is Christian America has liberalized their positions. We kind of like some of paganism. You know, we do. I mean, take this line. 60%, they say, of single people who call themselves Christian, 60% of Christian singles are sexually active. Are you sure they're Christians? Well, what do you mean they're sexually active, but they're Christians? That's not, there's no place in the Bible that will document that kind of behavior as fitting in with that. Huh? Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. But you see, we've liked enough of the paganist ideas that we've pushed God over there. So as long as you're wearing your fish pin, you're okay, you know. Whatever you're going to do tonight, make sure you got your fish pin on, because that's important. So the question is, will we take back some of the ground that we've given up? Are we willing to take it back? Next week, the victims of paganism. Next week, we have to look at the victims of paganism. Stand with me. This is where we've gone. This is where we're at. Bless your hearts. If anybody wanted to walk out, they held it. They stayed here. I told them on. This is the one where people walk out. Father, we have watched our country. Those of us that are of my generation have been there to see it happen. The baby boomers have seen it happen. They've seen it happen. We've seen our country give up the standards of God and trade for standards of paganism. Now we find ourselves in a real battle. Oh God, if the election had have gone the other way, and 2 Supreme Court justices would have been put on of a different flavor, we all know how quickly it would have gone down the drain. God, you have given us another moment of opportunity. A moment of opportunity. Wherein, if we really care as godly people, we can take action to show the world that we care, that we love you. And not by hating those awful liberals, but by loving them enough to show them that real love reaches out to all people, even the ones we don't agree with. So, Father, thank you for the day, and thank you for your love. Father, bless the people who are caught in these vicious traps of paganism. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.